Hello, today I'll be doing a video on Fire and Axe, a Viking Saga. This is the third edition of this game. I believe it came out in 2015, which is probably when I acquired it. I've played it several times. There was the second edition, which had a different cover, and I think even a different publisher. Came out in 2007. At one time I did have a copy of that, but I had sold it, and then later when this version came out, I bought it. And I believe there's even the original version came out in 2004, and I think it was called Viking Fury or something. But anyway, today I'm just going to be talking about Fire and Axe, a Viking Saga, the third edition, or the edition that came out in 2015. So let's get started with how to set up. All right, first thing you'll do is place the game board in the middle of the table. I'll just say that I think one of the complaints about this edition of this game was that this game board was too dark. They made everything dark, which is true. Like I said, I did have the second edition at one time, and I think I did prefer the colors of that map. They were lighter than this one. But anyway, let's get on with setup. First thing you do is put the game board in the middle of the table. Next, you take these small town figures and shuffle them up because they all have a value on the bottom, so you'll want to shuffle them up so nobody knows what values are where. And then you put one of them on each of these small ports that have a star on the map, like this. So let me get that done and I'll come back. Alright, so I've covered each of the small ports that had a star on them with a small town figure. Then you'll do the same, shuffle up these three larger town figures and then put them on each of the larger starred ports, Paris, Rome, and Constantinople. So we'll just do that like so. Next, you'll take this wind dial cover and place it here on the wind dial so that the blue hole is revealing the number 7 here in the south. And you just kind of line up the red lines so that all the there's a number revealed in each of the south, west, north, and east. Next, you'll take this preparation marker and put it on 0 days on the days track, and the same with this sailing marker. You'll place that on 0 days of the days track. Next, you'll take your saga deck, separate it into, you'll see that some have 1 sword on them, some have 2, and some have 3 swords, so you'll separate them. So the ones with 1 sword are your first era sagas, the ones with 2 swords are your second era sagas, and the ones with 3 swords are your third era sagas. You'll shuffle each of these decks separately and then remove 3 cards from each deck without looking at them. So let me get that done. Once that's done, that should leave you with 6 cards in each deck. You'll stack the first era on top of the second era, and then that on top of the third era, and that forms your saga deck, and you'll just place it somewhere near this side of the board. You'll take these 3 final round tokens and just place them underneath your saga deck. Finally, you'll take the first 3 Era 1 saga cards and place them face up in these spaces on the board where it says sagas. You'll then make stockpiles of your VP tokens, which also look like coins or treasure. So you have 1s, 3s, 10s, and 50s. And you'll also make stockpiles somewhere near the board of your goods. You got tusks, furs, and fish. You then take one of your fish good tokens and place it here on the board where it says goods in demand. You then take your rune deck, of course it says runes on the back, you'll shuffle that and place it on this space here on the board. So let me shuffle this. Alright, I've shuffled the deck and placed it on the space allotted for it on the board. Each player will then take a longboard ship in the color of their choice. They'll also take the 15 crew member figures that go along with the color of the long ship that they chose. They are in different poses, but there's no difference between them. They all are just crewmen. Each player will also take their long ship figure and place it here in the wintering zone on the board. I'm setting up for a 3-player game, so I'll be placing all 3 players' long ships here in the wintering zone. Alright, so as you can see, I've got green and red players as well. Each player will then draw 1 rune card, and they'll keep that in their hand and keep it secret from other players. Since I'm playing solo, I'm just going to go ahead and turn these over and reveal them. But they basically give you an ability or a one-time ability or something that you can do, and we'll talk more about that when we get into how to play. Choose a starting player by whichever method you choose. I'm going to go ahead and choose blue as my starting player, and they start with 1 victory point token. The second player starts with 2 victory point tokens, and the third player starts with 3. Of course, if you have 4 or 5 players, they'll get 4 and 5 tokens. Game comes with 3 dice. You'll just set those somewhere within reach of players. And that is it. We're all done with setup and ready to move on to how to play. Alright, so how do we play? Where the game is played in turns, starting with the first player, which we chose the blue player as the first player. And you can do several things on your turn. And if you look at your long ship board, you'll see that you can do actions, tasks, and other activities. And then there's a thing about final scoring right there. But first we'll talk about actions, since that's probably what you'll do at the beginning of the game. And one of the actions you can do is load your long ship. So you can only do loading while you're in the wintering zone, which is this area here, and it's where you start the game. So when you load, you can take a good of your choice, as long as there's one available, either tusks, fish, or furs, or you can take a crew member and load them onto your ship. So in the first era of the game, you just have these 5 spaces where you can load crew and goods. When we get to the second era, which is when you start revealing these saga cards with 2 swords on them, then you have an additional space, so you can load 6 goods or crew or a combination thereof. And finally, when you get to the third era, which is when you start revealing, when you start placing saga cards with 3 swords on them onto the board, then that unlocks the third era spot there, and that gives you 1 additional slot. But anyway, you can load goods and or crew, though you always have to load at least 1 crew member. But you can do any other combination, and you don't have to fill it up. You can load as many as you want up to the limit. But each time you load something onto your ship, you got to move the preparation marker up. So here we've loaded three things, 2 crew members and a fur. We would have to slide the preparation marker up 3. If we loaded, an additional, good, then we would have to move it up again. And sailing, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which is one of the other actions you can do. But when you sail, each time you sail to an adjacent space, you have to move your sailing marker up 1 on the day's track here. The total you can take on your turn for a combination of both the preparation and sailing is 7. So like if I if I loaded 4 things, and as I've done here, then if I wanted to start sailing, the most I could do is sail 3 spaces, because that adds up to 7. So the combination of preparation and sailing you can take on your turn can never total more than 7. And we'll talk about more about sailing in a little bit, but I just wanted to mention that. But let's get back to loading. So if we had loaded 4 items like we did here, 2 crew and 2 goods, we've moved the preparation marker up 4. Then we decide, okay, we're finished loading. Even though we have 1 additional spot, we'll just say that's all we want to do for now. Once you're finished loading, then you move your longship figure from the wintering zone to one of the homelands of your choice, Norway, Sweden, or Denmark. And each time you go to the wintering zone and load and come back, you can go to either one of those homelands. So it's your choice. So we'll just, for example, say this blue player decides he's done loading, so he moves to the Norway homeland. One of the things you can do while in a homeland is draw a rune card. So you start the game with 1, but if you want to, while you're in your homeland, you can draw an additional rune card, but that does take 1 preparation every time you draw a rune card, so you would have to move your preparation marker up 1. You could then draw another one if you wanted to and move it up again. The maximum rune cards you can have in your hand is 3, and you cannot draw an additional one if you already have 3 unless you use or discard 1. However, you cannot discard a rune while you're in your homeland, so that rule keeps you from just drawing and discarding until you get a rune card that you want. So when you're in your homeland, you can draw a rune card. Again, that does take 1 of your days of preparation. If you do, you can draw up to 3. Once you have 3, you cannot draw another one until you've used or discarded a card. And again, you cannot discard a card while you're in your homeland. While you're outside of your homeland, you can discard a card, but then you can't draw another one until you get back to your homeland. And I don't think I mentioned this, but when you finish loading and moved from the wintering zone to one of the 3 homelands, that doesn't cost any preparation days or sailing days to do that. Just once you finish loading, you move to one of those homelands at no cost. All right, so let's say we had just loaded our 4 goods. We didn't draw an additional rune card, so we've only used 4 of our preparation days. Because we can have a total of 7, that leaves us up to 3 days for sailing. So let's just say we were trying to get to Norwich here. That costs 1 day of sailing to move from a homeland into an adjacent water space. So we would have to move 1. So now we've used 5. Another day of sailing to move to an additional adjacent water space, and then another day of sailing to move there. So now I've used all 7 days that I have that I can spend for actions. So even though I was trying to get to Norwich, I could not get there on this turn because it does cost 1 additional day to sail into a port. However, if I'd been trying to get to Lincoln or York, then I could have sailed into one of those ports. And when you sail into a port, you just put the front part of your ship in there to show that you're in that port. And then whenever you are exiting a port, it costs 1 to sail back out into the adjacent water space. Now, one thing we should talk about sailing is you'll see that the board is divided up into 4 zones, which we saw here on this marker. It's got the east, north, west, and south. And so on the board you can see this gray area up here is the north zone, and it's divided by this border here. Then you've got the west, which is everywhere from this dotted line all the way down here until this line. this section here from this dotted line here to this dotted line is the south, and then the east is everything in this color up to this dotted line. And that is, the colors of the sea areas are a little different for each zone, but it may be kind of hard to tell that here in this video, except for the north, which is obvious. It's a lot lighter, it's a lot grayer. So if you look at the weather dial, it shows the number of clear weather days there are in each zone. So for instance, if you are sailing in the west, there's 5 clear weather days. So you could sail up to 5 days, as long as you didn't exceed your 7. Say this was down here. You could sail up to 5 without having any problems. If you were to move and sail a 6th day in the west, but because there's only 5 clear weather days, you then have to take losses. So you have to take either a good or a crewman from your ship and place it on the skull here. So if you exceed the number of clear weather days for the zone you're sailing in by 1 or 2, you'll have to put 1 good here. If you exceed it by 3 or 4, or well, a good or a crewman. If you exceed it by 3 or 4, you then have to put an additional. And if you exceeded it by 5, you then again have to take another one off of your ship. And then at the end of your turn, you discard those. So you're actually losing those goods or crewmen for your ship when you exceed the number of clear weather days that are available to sail in the zone that you're in. And one thing that you need to be careful about is maybe you start out in the west where there's 5 clear weather days. We'll just say these are both at 0. You're starting your turn, you're already in the water, and you sail 1 here to Orkney, 2 here to this sea zone. Well, you're not worried, because in the west you have 5 clear weather days. Then you decide to sail a 3rd day up there to the Faroes, but now you've crossed into the North Sea zone, and now you've exceeded, even though you were previously in the west, now you're in the north, which only has 2 clear weather days, and you've exceeded it, so you would have to take a loss. And if you sailed further, then you would take even more losses. So if you cross a zone border while you're sailing, the new zone that you cross into is the one that you have to use for the clear weather days. Alright, so I think that covers the possible actions you can take: load your ship, draw rune, or sail. Those are the actions you can do. And again, those each cost days, and you can never use more than 7 days. So next, we'll talk about tasks. So if you sail into a port, so let's say we sailed into this port, maybe we used 3 days to get there. When you're in a port, you can perform a task there. One of the tasks you can do is trade. And if you have a good and there is not already a good in that port, you can take one of the goods from your ship, put it into that port, and then you'll take a number of victory points equal to that port's value, which in this case is 4, Norwich, so I would take 4 victory points. But also, because I delivered the good that's in demand, which you can see as fish, I would get an additional 2 victory points. So I would take 6 victory points, 4 for the point's value and 2 for the port's value, and 2 additional because I delivered a good in demand. Now, fish are not always the good in demand. For example, this guy has this rune card, which he could play at any time on his turn, where he could discard the good in demand and replace it with one of his choice. So he could change the good in demand. But if ever you do trade in a port and put the good from your ship that is the good in demand, you get an additional 2 victory points in addition to whatever the value of that port is. So that's trading. Now, a port may never contain more than one goods token. So once somebody has traded in a port, that goods token stays there, and you can not other players or that same player can usually never trade in that port again. There may be some rune card that makes an exception to that, but usually once there's a good in a port, it stays there, and no other player can trade there. Now, most of the ports belong to a region. A region is usually made up of 3 ports, and they are the same color. So you can see these 3, York, Lincoln, and Norwich, form a region. You can tell that they are the same color, and they have the same design around the ring of their port. So whenever you're trading, besides one port can never hold more than one good, you cannot trade the same type of good in a region where one of the other ports in that region already has that type of good. So since fish have been traded in this port of Norwich, fish could not ever in the future be traded in Lincoln or York. It would have to be one of the different types of goods, either tusks or furs. And you can trade in a port, if this player had moved here into Lincoln, just because it has a town there, that doesn't prevent you from trading. He could have traded there and just put that under his little town marker, and he would still get the 4 for the port value and the 2 for doing the good in demand. So you can trade where there's a town or a settlement. We haven't talked about settlement yet, but I just wanted to mention that. So trading is a task. That is not the same as an action. So when you trade, you don't move anything on this day's track, not the preparation or the sailing marker. You can do as many tasks as you want on a turn, but you can never do more than one task in a single port in one turn. So you can do a trade in a port in like I could do a trade in Lincoln, but another task is like a raid. I couldn't then try to raid it or settle it. So the 3 tasks you can do are trade, raid, and settle. And as I said, you can do as many tasks as you can or want to on a turn, but you can only attempt one task in a single port one time per turn. All right, so let's talk about another kind of task, raid, which I mentioned. So if you sail into a port and you decide to do a raid task there, what you'll do is look at that port's value, which here it is a 4. Now, if it happens to have if somebody's traded there previously and there's a trade good there, then that number, whatever the port value is reduced by 1. So sometimes, and usually, it's a good idea to trade in a port before trying to raid it. Now, again, you couldn't do that on the same turn. You couldn't trade at a port and then immediately try to raid it, because you can only attempt one task in one port per turn. But if you had traded on a previous turn or somebody else had traded there and you go there and try to raid, it does reduce the port value by 1. But in this case, we'll say there's no goods token there, so its value is 4. So I've sailed into that port. I'm going to attempt to raid. Now you have to look at the number of figures you have loaded on your ship, and that is the maximum number of raid attempts you can make, up to 3. If I had more than 3 crew, I would still only have a maximum of 3 attempts. But since I only have 2 crew, I could only make 2 attempts to raid. When you attempt to raid, you grab a dice and you roll it, and you're trying to exceed that port value. So that port value is 4. I could only be successful if I rolled a 5 or 6. So I'm successful. I rolled a 5. Then I was successfully raided. I would take that town. I would flip it over and see how many victory points it's worth. I would then take those victory points. In this case, it's 6. Put them in my area, and then keep that town figure, because that will come into play in scoring at the end of the game. If, however, I had failed, and maybe I rolled a 3, then I failed my raid attempt. I would have to lose one of my crew members, and then I would have I still have one more crew member. I could attempt it again if I wanted to. Then if I'm successful, the same thing. I remove the token, get whatever victory points are under it. However, if you ever lose the last crew member on your ship, then you immediately move your ship back to the wintering zone, and you have to discard any goods that you had on that ship. And then at the beginning of your next turn, you'll be in the wintering zone, and you can load just like we talked about previously. All right, so that's raiding. Let's talk about settling. So we'll say we had previously raided, and we sailed into this port, and we want to try to settle this port. When you're attempting to settle, again, you look at the port value, and then you roll a number of dice up to the number of crew members you have, up to a maximum of 3. The difference here with raiding is, like I have 2 crew members, I have to roll both dice at once. And again, I'm trying to exceed that number, so I would need a 5 or 6. I got a 4 and a 1, so I failed. So I would have to lose both my crew members, and then of course I would have to discard those goods and move back to the wintering zone. But let's say I was successful and one of my dice was successful. I rolled a 6 and a 1. Well, because 1 was a failure, I would have to discard one of my crew. But then with my remaining crew, I can settle. And when you settle, you put one of the crew member from your longship onto that port. Now, because that was my last crew member, unfortunately, I would have to move back to the wintering zone and discard these goods. If I had maybe I rolled a 5 and a 6, so I didn't lose that crew member, and I still had 1 left after I settled and put the guy on there. So then I would still have 1 crew member, and I wouldn't have to immediately return to the wintering zone. So again, when you settle, you can roll a number of dice up to the number of crew members you have, up to a maximum of 3, and you roll them all at once. And for any that do not exceed the port's value, you've got to lose a crew member. But if any of them do exceed the port value, then you get to place a crew member onto that. From your longship, you have to take it from your longship and place it onto that port. And just like a raid attempt, if there's a goods there when you're doing a settle attempt, you do subtract 1 from the port value, so it would be a 3 instead of a 4. So it's always probably better to try to settle or raid a port that somebody has already traded in, since that subtracts 1 from the value. Now, you can never attempt to settle a port that has a town in it, so you always have to raid a town or raid a port to remove the town marker before you can settle it. You can never settle one that has a town marker in it. And you cannot settle another port in the same region as long as one of the ports in that region has a town. So before Norwich, York, or Lincoln could be settled, somebody would have to raid and remove the town marker for Lincoln, and then after that, any of these ports in this region could have settlement attempt. I did want to mention there are some ports that are independent and are not part of a region, and those are ones that are gray, such as Seville, Compostela, Bordeaux, these that are gray, and also the big ones, Rome, Constantinople, and Paris. Those are all independent, so they're not part of a region, so you can trade or settle those without having to worry about region restrictions. And there's a few other independent ones around the board, but anyway, they're the ones that are gray and don't have a design around the port. All right, so those are the different types of tasks you can do. They're all tasks you would do in a port, and that's trade, raid, or settle. But again, remember, you can only do one task in one port per turn. So then there's what's called the other activities. One of those is to play or discard a rune. So if you have a card, I mean, they pretty much say when you can play them. Otherwise, you can just play them anytime on your turn. So, like this one, to change the good in demand, I could play that. Then you just put it in a discard pile near the rune deck. Whenever the rune deck is empty, if it becomes empty, you can shuffle it and form a new rune deck. But yeah, whenever you play a rune card, you put it in there. You can also just discard a rune card on your turn as long as you're not in your homeland. And when you discard it, you just put it in the discard pile. Whenever you play or discard a rune card before doing whatever the rune card says, you have the option to change the weather dial. And when you do that, you can turn it one space either clockwise or one space counterclockwise. So maybe the blue is usually always the best sailing. So maybe you want to hinder somebody that you know is sailing in the west. So before you say you're going to play this rune card, but before carrying out whatever it says on the card, you can adjust the weather dial. So you would turn it one space, and again you just align the red lines so that the window displays the numbers. And so now you've reduced the number of clear sailing days here in the west, but you've increased it a little bit in these other areas. So again, you can adjust it whenever you play or discard a rune card before doing whatever the rune card says. You have the option to adjust the weather dial one space clockwise or counterclockwise. And that's just considered another activity that doesn't use any days or anything like that. You can also, at any time on your turn, just decide you're going to move to the wintering zone. So maybe your ship is way up here. You've done everything you want to do. You're just down to a couple of crewmen, and so you decide, okay, I'm going to move to the wintering zone. So when you do that, you move your ship to the wintering zone, and you have to discard everything on your longship except for one crewman, and then you can start your next turn with one crewman in the wintering zone. So if you had any other goods or other crew on your ship, those would get discarded, but you can keep one crewman, and then that ends your turn. As soon as you say you're moving to the wintering zone during your turn, then you move it there, discard everything on the ship but one crewman, and then end your turn. And of course, anytime you get sent back to the wintering zone involuntarily because you've lost the last crewman on your ship, that also immediately ends your turn. Okay, one of the other activities you can do is to complete a saga. And completing the sagas will drive most of what you're trying to do during the game. So you'll see you start with 3 sagas, 3 Era 1 sagas, and they'll have some goal. So this says trade Norwich, Lincoln, and York. So that means you'll be trying to get a trade good on Norwich, Lincoln, and York. But whichever player is the last one or does the final thing that completes that saga, so it doesn't matter who did. If the green player had put a trade good in Lincoln and York, but then the red player managed to come and trade with Norwich, he would complete that saga and get to take the saga card. So it's whoever does the final thing that completes that saga that they get to take that card and keep it in their play area. and that will give them points at the end of the turn during final scoring, and we'll talk about that when we talk about scoring. But when you complete a saga, do everything that it says on there, or be the final person to do that, you take that and then replace it with a new saga off the saga deck. And as I mentioned, once you place one with 2 swords on there, then you're in the second era, and you get to start using this space on your longship. And when you place one with 3 long swords on there, because these have all been used, then that opens, you're in the third era, and that opens up this additional space on your ship. There's also, besides trade, these happen to all be trade, but there's other types of sagas. For instance, here's Raid Lindisfarne. So whoever happened to raid Lindisfarne, which is this town right here, once somebody's successfully raided that, they would take this saga card. There are also settle saga cards, so if somebody manages to settle these 3 ports, Elan, Talum, and Riga, then they take that saga. And again, another player, the blue player could have settled Elan, and the red player may have settled Riga, but if the green player went and then settled Tallinn, or Talon, however it's said, they would then get to take the saga card. So it's the player that actually completes it, or does the last thing on there, that gets to take the saga card. It doesn't matter who has maybe done part of it. As long as you do the final thing that completes it, you get to take the saga card, put it in your play area, and then replace it with a new one off of the deck. When somebody takes the last saga card and places it onto the board, that reveals these final round tokens. That player that took that, that completed that last saga and replaced it with the last saga card in the deck, will then take these 3 final round tokens and put them in their play area. And that will trigger the end of the game. So from then on going forward, every time it is that player's turn again, they'll take one of those final round tokens and place it on one of these spaces on the board. So that will give them 3 more turns. Once they place it at the start of their turn, when they take their 3rd turn after getting those tokens, after they've completed that 3rd turn, then the game ends immediately and you go to scoring. If before that happens, the last saga card is completed that's on the board, then that will immediately end the game and you'll go to scoring. So before we get to scoring, let's just mention the 3 ways that your turn can end. So your turn can end if the last crew member on your ship is removed because you failed to raid or settle, or because you did successfully settle and use the last crew member on your ship to place it on the settlement. So whichever reason, whenever the last crew member on your ship is removed and you immediately have to move to the wintering zone, that immediately ends your turn. If you voluntarily on your turn decide to move to the wintering zone, as I mentioned before, you have to remove everything from your ship except 1 crewman, and then that will immediately end your turn. And finally, if you're just out sailing around and you've used all your sailing days, and or preparation and sailing days have totaled 7, or you've just sailed as far as you want to and don't want to risk sailing any further because of clear weather days, and you just say you're ending your turn, that's the other way your turn ends. And then you just stay where you are, and at the beginning of your next turn you can begin sailing from where you're at. So those are the 3 ways your turn can end. Alright, so once the game ends, either because the last saga has been completed, or the player who took the final round tokens has completed their 3rd and final round after they took those tokens, their 3rd and final turn after they took those tokens, that ends the game, and then you go to scoring. So, of course, first you'll have victory points that you've gained from trading and raiding and so forth throughout the game. So then next you'll have the bloodied axe bonus. So for all players, every time you successfully raid a town, you get to take the town figure and put it in your play area. So then at the end of the game, all players count the number of town figures, large and small, that they have in their play area, and the person with the most town figures gets the bloody axe bonus of 3 victory points per town. So if you had 3 towns, you'd get 9 victory points, so you'd take those in victory point tokens. And again, that's only the player with the most. If there's a tie for the most, then both players get 3 victory points per town that they have. Next, you score settlements. So for every port that you've settled, you gain victory points equal to that port's value. So the blue player, if he settled and placed a figure there, he would get 2 victory points. So again, he would take 2 victory points and put them in his play area for that settlement. If in a region, like this is all one region here, if at least 2 of those ports has been settled, when you're scoring your settlement points for that region, if 2 of the ports have been settled, then you get double the value of the port. And if 3 of them have been settled, then you get triple the value. And it doesn't matter which players settled that region. So this is all one region. So the green player, because their values are tripled, because all 3 ports in the region have been settled, the green player would get 9 for Iona and 6 for Herbides. And the red player would get 9 for Caithness, or however you say that. But anyway, now if only 2 of the ports had been settled, then the green player would get 6, double the amount, 6 for Iona, and this player would get 6 for this port. So you go around scoring all the ports that have been settled that way and get the victory points. Next, you score sagas. So you score them per type. So you sort your sagas that you've completed by homeland. So, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. And then the player who has the most of that type, so for instance, this guy only has 1 Norway, this guy has none, this guy has 2, you then score, the player with the most of that homeland type scores 10 points per saga that they completed from that homeland. The player with the second most points, so he had 2, he has 1 Norway, this guy's none, then scores 5 points per saga that they have from that homeland. So he would score 5 points for this Norway. This guy would score 10, he would score 20 for his 2 Norway. And you do that for all the homelands. So whoever has the most Norways would score 10 per saga card. Whoever had the second most Norways would score 5 per saga card. Whoever had the most Swedens would get 10 per. Whoever had the second most, and so forth, until you've scored all the saga cards. If there's a tie for the most saga cards, then the 2 tied players for the most each score 10 victory points for each saga card they have of that homeland, and then the second place player gets nothing. And if there's a tie for second most, then the players that are tied for second most each get 5 victory points for each saga they have that they're tied for second place. And once all those victory points have been distributed, then the players total their victory points, and the player with the most victory points is the winner. And in the unlikely event that those players, or the 2 or more players tie for the most victory points, then they're just declared shield brothers and are equals and can go raid and pillage until the next game. Anyway, that is how you play Fire and Axe. So let me get the board. I think it's almost pretty much set up how it was after I showed the setup. But let me get it all back to how it should be, and we'll go through a few example turns. Alright, so let's do a few example rounds. Oh, this should not be on here. Alright, blue player is the first player. We'll start with him. Everybody is in the wintering zone, so first thing he's going to do is take some load actions. So I think he's going to load up, we'll have him load up 2 crewmen and 2 fish. So we know we've got to move our preparation up 4 days. Well, we'll go ahead and have him load one more and fill. That's the most he can put, because those aren't available until the second and third era. But we loaded 5 things, so we got to move our preparation up. All right, now he can move to a homeland of his choice. I think he's going to start working on one of these trade sagas. So he's going to, after he's finished loading, he can move to a homeland. He's going to move to the Sweden homeland. And then there, I think he's going to draw another rune card. Remember, you can have up to 3. He's going to draw that one. That does take up 1 day of preparation. He could draw another one, but he's not going to. He's going to use his last day. Remember, you can only have a total of 7 to go ahead and set sail. So he's going to sail there. So that's going to use 1 day of sailing. That's a total of 7, so he can't use any more days. He can't sail anymore. He's not in a port, so he can't do any tasks. He could do another activity and use one of his rune cards, but he doesn't want to use any of those right now. So he's just going to say that's it. He's going to end his turn. So he'll reset these markers, and we move on to the next player. Alright, the red player's turn. He's going to do something similar, I think. He's probably going to load up a couple of guys and a couple of goods. He'll take a couple of goods, so that's 4 days of preparation. Then he's going to move to a homeland, so he'll move to Denmark. And then he's going to take a rune card as well, just to see what he gets. Alright, anyway, that does cost him a day to gain that rune card. And then he's going to go ahead and set sail. I think he's going to work on this saga here, trading with Norwich, Lincoln, and York, which are here. So he's only used 5 days, so he can sail for 2 days. So he's going to go 1, 2, 1, 2. That's a total of 7. He can't go anymore. And he's easily within the clear sailing days. There's 5, and he's only spent 2. So that's going to end his turn. So now green's turn. He is, again, probably going to do something similar. He'll load 2 guys, and we'll say he's going to load 3 goods. So he'll take a fish, a tusks, and a fur. So he's loaded 5 things. Oh, the red player should have reset these at the end of his turn. Alright, but he's loaded 5 things, which is the most he can load at this point. He's now going to move to a homeland. He's going to move to Sweden as well. He's not going to draw another rune card at this time. Since he's used 5 days of preparation, he still has 2 days of sailing he could do. And in the east, currently you could sail up to 4 days without any issue. So maybe he's going to go after this one. So he's going to set sail 1, 2, so 2 sailing days. And that's a total of 7, so he can't sail anymore. He's not in a port, he can't do any other actions, so he's probably going to end his turn at that point. So he will reset these. And of course, also at the end of your turn, if you have any goods or crew on the losses, you put those back in your supply. Alright, we're back to the blue player. He's trying to work on this saga here, so he needs to go to one of these cities: Nesvit, Nezdovo, Lubeck, or Kiev, which are down here. So he's going to sail. That's one. And from here, he can sail into this Nezdovo. So that's 2 sailing days, and then he's in that port. Now he's going to do, because he's in a port, he can do a task. So he's going to do a trade task. So he will trade here in Nezdovo and put this fish good in there. That gives him 4 plus 2 because fish is in demand. So he gets 6 victory points for that. All right. He can't do any other tasks in that port because you're only allowed to do 1 task in 1 port. So he is going to set sail again. So that's going to be a 3rd sailing day. In the east, currently, you can only sail 4 clear weather days. Now, his problem is these all form a region, and he brought another fish good, which you can't have, 2 ports in the same region can't have the same good, so he can't come to one of these other ones and put a fish good in them, so he kind of messed up. So what he's going to do is he will sail into Riga. It looks like it's just open. The port is just open to this sea area or this area, so he'll sail into port there in Riga. So that's going to be another day. And then he will trade there with this fish good that he has on his ship, because that is a different region than here, so he's okay to trade there. So that gives him 2, and plus it's a good in demand, 2 more, so that gives him 4 victory points. Now, he probably doesn't want to sail back out because he's used 4 sailing days in the east. So if he sailed back out, he would be having to take losses for exceeding his clear weather days. So I think what he's going to do at this point is say he's going back to the wintering zone. So when he does that, he can only keep 1 guy, so he's got to lose those 2 crew. But then he can load more goods at the beginning of his next turn. So that's going to end his turn. He'll reset these to 0, and it'll be the red player's turn now. Alright, the red player is here. He's going to sail into York. That's 1 sailing day. Then he will trade there with this fish good in demand. And that will give him 4 plus 2 because it's a good in demand, so 6 victory points. And then he will sail back out of York, so that's going to be another sailing day. He will then sail into Lincoln, so that's going to be another sailing day. He's now in the port of Lincoln, so he's going to trade there. He can trade there because he has a different type of good. These are all in the same, region, so he couldn't put another fish good, but he brought a fur with him, and that will also help him reduce the value of that when he goes to raid it. So he traded that fur. He gets 4. Since it's not in demand, he doesn't get the extra 2, but he does get 4 victory points for that. Now, he does have some crew, but he can't attempt to raid Lincoln there because he's already done 1 task in that port, and you can only do 1 task in a port per turn. He doesn't have any other goods, so there's no sense in sailing to Norwich at this point. So I think he is just going to end his turn at that point. So He's going to reset the days, and he's going to call that a turn. Alright, back to green. He was up here. He's going to sail one and then into this port at Staraha Ladoga. So that's 2 sailing days, and then he's going to trade a good in demand there off of his ship. So that's going to be 3 for the port value, 2 for the good and the demand, so a total of 5 victory points for him. Alright, then he's going to sail back out of there, so that'll be another sailing day. He will sail 1 to there, so that's another sailing day. Now 4 is the clear weather days in the east, but he wants to get into Rostov and trade there. So he's going to go ahead and move into Rostov, so that's another clear sailing day. So he's exceeded the clear sailing days in the east, so he needs to take a loss. So he's going to put a crew member on that skull, because he exceeded it by 1, so he has to take a loss. But then he's going to trade in Rostov. He brought different goods, so even though those are in the same region, he didn't bring another fish, so he can trade a tusk. So that's going to give him 3. It's not a good in demand, so he doesn't get the bonus of 2, but that gives him 3. He's now going to go ahead and sail back out of port in Rostov. That's going to be 6, but he still only exceeded the clear weather days by 2, so he doesn't have to take another loss. He would have to wait and sail another day. That would make him take another loss, which he's not going to do that, because that would remove his last crew or his last good, which he wants to be able to put in Bulgar next turn. So he's going to stop there. So that's the end of his turn, so he'll reset these and go ahead and return this loss to his supply. And that's the end of his turn. Back to blue's turn. He's just going to load up again, so he'll load 2 guys, and he'll do a fur and a tusk. So that's a total of 4. He already had the 1, so that's 4 preparation days. Then he will move to Sweden, and he's not going to draw a card. He's just going to start sailing. So he's going to go 1 here, 2 here, and 3 here. And that's total of 7 days of action, so he can't, even though he has another clear sailing day, a total of 7 is all you can use of days, so he can't sail anymore. So that's pretty much all he can do. So he's going to end his turn, so he'll reset these to 0. Alright, back to red's turn. He's still up here in Lincoln. Because it's a new turn now, he can attempt to raid Lincoln. He's got 2 guys. The port value is 4, but he's got a trade good in there, which lowers it to 3. So he's going to attempt to raid. So he can make up to 2 attempts since he's got 2 guys. So he's going to roll 1 dice. Since the port value is 3, he needs to exceed that. So he needs a 4, 5, or 6. A 1, so he fails. So he's got to lose a guy. So he can try 1 more if he wants to, which he is going to. Still needs 4, 5, or 6. Got a 6, so he's successful. So he will remove this town marker. He gets to look at it. He gets 6 victory points for that. And then he just keeps this town marker in his play area. So to complete this saga, he needs to go to Norwich and trade there, which he could do. He hasn't used any sailing days, so he could easily sail over there. But unfortunately, he's not got any goods. So I think what he's going to do is just go back to the wintering zone and end his turn. Because he voluntarily went back, he gets to keep 1 guy, which he did. And that will end his turn. Alright, back to green's turn. He's headed over here to Bulgar, so he's just going to sail. That's 1 to move there, and he'll sail into port at Bulgar, so that's 2. And then he will trade a fur, which he can do because that is different than any good in that region so far. So he trades there, gets 3 victory points for that. And now he's completed this saga to trade in Staraha, Ladoga, Rostov, and Bulgar. So he gets to take this saga card, and now he'll replace it with this one. And I think he's just going to move back to the wintering zone because he's, pretty far from everything. So he's going to move back to the wintering zone. He gets to keep his 1 guy. That's going to end his turn. So he resets the counters. And now it's Blue's turn again. Alright, just to show the use of something, we know that Blue, he's going to go into Lubeck and do a trade because he's trying to complete this saga here, which is trade at Nezdovo, Lubeck, and Kiev, which he's already done there. But he's got a fur and a tusk, which are not the goods in the demand, so he's going to use this card, discard the good in demand box, and replace it with one of your choice from the supply. But before he does that, he is going to go ahead and adjust by 1 the weather dial. So he's going to move it 1 this way. So let's just line up the... So he increased the clear sailing days in the east. And now he's using this, so he's going to discard this good in demand. And he's going to make it one of the ones that he has, so he's going to make it a tusk. Alright, and now he's going to start his turn, so he's going to sail 1 day into Lubeck. So that's 1 sailing day. Now he's going to trade there. He's going to trade the tusk he has on his ship. So we'll just put that under there. So that's going to give him 4, plus because that's now the good in demand, he's going to get 6. Alright, so that's the only task he can do in Lubeck since he's done 1 task. So now he's going to sail back out. Now you can sail out into any sea space that's connected to that port. So he's actually going to sail out here. That will be 1 sailing day. And then he's going to sail into Kiev. That will be another sailing day. And now he's going to trade at Kiev. That's a fish and that's a tusk. He can trade fur there, so there's not any same good in this region because that is all 1 region. So he's safe to trade that fur good. So he gets 4. It's not in demand, so he doesn't get the bonus. So 3, 4, and now he's completed this saga of trading with Nezdovo, Lubeck, and Kiev, so he gets to keep that saga card. And now we reveal another one. And now he can't do any more tasks in there because he did a trade task, so he's going to sail out back into this sea zone. And there's 5 clear weather days, so he's going to sail again and move up here. And I think that's where he's going to end his turn. He's not going back to the wintering zone because we got this saga that came out to settle Elan, Tallinn, and Riga, which are in this area here. And he's got some guys on his ship, so he should go ahead and at least work on that. But now he doesn't want to sail again because he would lose one of his crew if he did for exceeding the clear weather days, so he's just going to end his turn at that point. Alright, it's the red player's turn. I'm going to go ahead and play ahead a little bit off camera until we get to something that we haven't seen yet. Alright, I've played ahead a little bit. It's Blue's turn again. He wants to do this settle, as we talked about, Elan, Tallinn, and Riga. So he's here. He's going to move probably to Riga here. So he's going to do a sail and sail here. And then he will sail again into Riga. And then he's going to try to settle it. Now, its value is only 2, but minus 1 for the good in there. So he only needs to get, as long as he doesn't roll a 1, he's good. He's got 3 guys on his ship, so he could, trying to settle, he could roll all 3 dice. But I don't know. I don't think he needs to. He's just going to roll 2. And both of them are successful because he only, as long as he didn't roll a 1, he was good. So he will take 1 guy there and settle Riga. And now he can use another move to move out of Riga. He's going to come out on this side, and he's going to sail again up to this sea space. And he's in the east, so he has 5 clear weather days, so he's going to sail again and sail into Talon. Now, because there's no good there, he'll have to roll better than a 2, so 3, 4, 5, or 6. He's only got 2 guys left, so he can only roll 2 dice. He's got to roll them both at once, so as long as we get 3, 4, 5, or 6, which we do, so he's successful. So he has to take one of his crew and put it there in Talon. And now he doesn't want to sail again, because if he did, he would exceed the clear weather days, and he would have to lose the last guy he's got on his ship, which he doesn't want to do because he wants to use that person to settle Eland. So he's just going to end his turn there and reset the days counters. Alright, it's Red's turn, but I did want to show he's going to play a rune card. Choose a player. That player must choose one of his or her own settlements on the board to hand over to you. Replace the settlement's crew member with one of your own. So he's going to play that on the blue player and replace his figure in Talon. But before he does that, he wants to adjust because he's playing a rune, he can adjust the dial. So he's going to shift it back this way. And now he's going to play that, so he's going to replace the blue player's settlement with his. And then he hasn't used any actions yet, so he's going to use 1 sail action to sail up here, and then use a 2nd sail action to move into port here at Lindisfarne. And then he's going to do a raid because there's a saga card to raid there. So he's going to raid. He's got 3 guys. There is not a goods there, but it's only got a port value of 2. So as long as he gets 3, 4, 5, or 6, he's good. Only rolling 1 die since it's a raid. He got a 3, so he's successful. So he'll remove this town. He gets 3 victory points, puts that town in his supply for scoring at the end of the game, and gets 3 victory points. Now he'll take this card and put that in his... He's now completed 2 sagas. Now you can see this one has 2 swords on it, so we're moving into the 2nd era. So now people can start using this spot on their ship. Anyway, I think we've shown a raid, we've shown a settle, we've shown trade. So I think we've shown a little bit of everything. You should have a good idea of how the game plays. This video's gone over an hour now, so I think I'm going to wrap it up. But as I said at the beginning, I've played this game solo as 3 players. I've played it with other players, and we always have fun with it. I like this game. So I don't know if it's still available to buy anymore. Like I said, I bought this quite a while back, but anyway, it's a fun game. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it.